Guinness is perhaps the most successful Irish product or brand, and history, or at least a version of history, has been key to its success. Over the last century, the Guinness Company has carefully crafted a narrative about its past that has been key to its success. They've endorsed books, documentaries, and even podcasts to tell their story, and while these are often well researched, they are highly selective. And don't get me wrong, there's much about the Guinness Company that does set them apart. Historically, they were considered the best employers in Dublin. But, as with any story, there are two sides to the history of Guinness. Arthur Guinness, the celebrated founder of the company, was accused of being an informer for the British in the 1790s. Over the following century and more, the Guinness Company consistently opposed Irish independence and supported the strongest possible links between Ireland and Britain. Now, while national identity is complex and ever-changing, and many Irish people did support the union with Britain in the 19th century, this isn't part of the image that Guinness certainly promotes today. There's also other less than glorious chapters to the history of the company that they are keen to forget, and you don't even have to go that far back to find them. Lots of you will remember Arthur's Day, for example. This was an attempt to create a national holiday of sorts centred around the Guinness Company. Now, ultimately, as you'll hear in this episode, it backfired pretty spectacularly and is unlikely to feature prominently in future histories of the company. But all this got me thinking that a show that delves into the lesser known aspects of Ireland's most famous brand would be fascinating. And after a summer of intense topics where we've looked at things like the Troubles, witchcraft trials, it also makes for a lighter topic. Now, at this point, if you're tuning in for the first time, I should say my name is Finn Dwyer and this is the Irish History Podcast. But this episode breaks with the normal format because to delve into the history of Guinness, I reached out to two friends and former guests on the show, Eoin Tabb and DJ Walsh, who host the eclectic podcast Snugcast, and we met up in a local pub here in Waterford, Philly Grimes, to shine a light on some of the less talked about aspects of the history of Guinness. Now, in just half an hour, we obviously couldn't cover the entire history of Guinness, but we did chat about its complicated past. We started out by setting the scene and looking at where pub culture as such emerged when pints replaced hard liquor in Ireland after the famine, and from there, we explored lots of various facets of Guinness's history. Now, before we dive into this episode, I have a major announcement. If you're a regular listener to the show, you know that I rarely do live podcasts. In fact, I can't remember the last time I did one. It might even be 2 years ago. But that's about to change. I'm thrilled to announce that I'll be doing a live show at the Cork Podcast Festival on September the 6th. It's on in a great venue, that's St. Luke's Church, and I have some fabulous guests lined up for what's going to be a really great evening. Now, all that's needed to complete what's going to be a great night is yourself, and I can't wait to meet you there. It is just for one night only though, and tickets are limited. I have a link in the show notes below, so get your tickets today. Finally, before we kick off, a big thanks to Tom in Phil Grimes for allowing us to record this show in the snug in the pub. As you're about to hear, it gave a really nice, cosy sound to the episode. And of course, I also want to thank DJ and Eoin. You can check out their podcast, Snugcast. I've links to that in the show notes below. And Eoin also makes a bit of a niche show, but if you work in healthcare, it might be for you. It's focused on the fundamentals of cancer care. I also have links to that below as well. Sound on today's episode is by Kate Dunley. If we're talking about Guinness, lads, I think we go back to where an awful lot of my podcasts start and end is with the famine. But Irish drinking culture changes a lot in the aftermath of the famine, not really to do with it, but you get the emergence of modern pub culture in that idea of people going to drink pints, and it replaces liquor as the big drink of preference or choice. Like, a lot of it is just down to taxation, that the government starts to tax liquor, people start drinking pints because of that. But at that moment, Guinnesses are really well positioned to take advantage of that because they have a brewery set up in Dublin. They're already brewing what I suppose an earlier predecessor of the Guinness that people drink today. But I suppose it's worth defining what stout is for people listening at home. I don't know, DJ, do you want to take up this?
I suppose, yeah, stout is a grain-based alcoholic drink that, I suppose the stout that Guinness is now, which is a nitrogenated stout, so what gives it the kind of creamy head and stuff, certainly as you said, Finn, it would have been quite different up until relatively recently, it would have been a lot, I suppose, flatter as a drink. People who might be familiar with the large bottles of Guinness off the shelf, like that's a much better representation of, say, what Guinness would have been served back in that post-famine era.
I think there's purists as well now that would argue that the coffee notes and the taste and the complexities of that point have been cut down as a result of that nitrogenation that occurred at the time.
When you're saying nitrogenation, putting nitrogen.
Introduction of nitrogen into it, yeah. And that's actually only a recent development. That's 1945, I think, is the introduction of nitrogen into the pint. So
very interesting year for history, 1945. I suppose the technology back then for distribution of drinks and stuff like that was still primarily barrels. So like you weren't getting what we consider to be Guinness today. You know, it was quite a different drink even back then. But you would certainly, I suppose, have seen people probably appealing to people, as you said, Finn, because liquor was taxed so much. I think as well there was probably, if I recall, there was a big clamp down on kind of poaching stills and stuff like this as well at the time.
I don't know for certain. I suspect though that some of this is also to do with like people moving into factories, and whereas you could have more kind of quote unquote flexible attitudes to alcohol, you know, when people are working in farms and things like that. Obviously when people are working around machinery, but also the idea of an 8-hour shift, you have to start at 8 and finish at whatever, 4, 6, 8, whatever. Yeah. But like that has to work. You can't have any flexibility in the system. So employers, well, drinking at work does go on. I think Guinness is used to allow their workers to have 2 pints a day. Or you want to cut down people drinking really hard liquor that, you know, has people really drunk.
Well, if you think about it, like a serving of whiskey, which is, you know, a high percentage alcohol drink, 40-50% say, versus a 4.5-5%, you know, alcoholic drink that's, you know, a pint, so half a litre or so. It just probably controls the alcohol intake as well, and has people having a better control of their sensorium in that kind of, you know, industrial revolution area, whereas you said working conditions were not great. So if you were going for a couple of drinks and if you started hammering the bottle of whiskey like you weren't, and as well there was very little social protection in those days. There was no social protection. So if you lost your job because you were hitting the bottle hard, like you had no safety net.
I think a lot of it was actually driven by employers though, because
I think Guinness were renowned for it as well, that they really wanted to control their workers' attitudes and behaviours at the time. So probably ironically, they didn't want them getting absolutely langers and falling around the place and being very drunk. And maybe I think that 2 pint limit was like a limit. They actually wanted to influence behaviours of the workforce. And it's probably like, I don't know, if you think about like the likes of Google and these guys, whereby they brought in the, you know, happy Fridays, we'll have a few beers at lunch, but it's, you know, that's to avoid people going to the pub, to keep them in the workforce and to keep them working. Like, you know, it's to kind of increase that productivity. And I think Guinness were probably very smart in that aspect, that they noticed that they could benefit and increase productivity in the workforce by, you know, enabling by controlling their behaviours as well, you know.
That was the smoothest segue, because I was sitting here going, how am I going to bring, how do I move the conversation onto Guinness? But I think above all other like beers, and I'd even say like products, there's a few products that have become more synonymous with a country, obviously Guinness with Ireland, and particularly with Dublin, like where St James's Gate Brewery is. And like the history of Guinness, we could literally spend weeks recording podcasts about different aspects of the history of Guinness. But I think there's an interesting thing there about where Guinness certainly market themselves today, and maybe the reality behind the company. And I suppose it's fair to say that Guinness have a pretty complicated history. And maybe, I think a good way to start it is to start it with Arthur Guinness himself, the first a brewer, the person who founded the St James's Gate Brewery, and then subsequent generations of the family, who've definitely, their actions, their thoughts, their views have stood in pretty stark contrast to the way they've marketed themselves. Like Arthur Guinness himself was, and I've got mixed views on this one, but Arthur Guinness himself was like criticised or named by the United Irishmen in the 1790s, the Republican rebels, as being a spy for Dublin Castle, which I think does stand in sharp contrast to the way Guinnesses, they never overtly say it, but you get the impression that Guinnesses are kind of identify with independence in Ireland. But it's very subtly done. They never say it, but they definitely trade on it, I think.
Yeah, he associated with, I don't know, republicanism.
No, it's a funny thing. I think, as you say, like the United Irishmen called out Arthur Guinness. It's what makes it very interesting for me is, like, you know, the brewery of St James, Guinness Brewery at St James's Gate, you know, famously since 1759. Like 1759 was prior to the penal laws being reformed. So just even that kind of, I suppose, juxtaposition of like the brewery being founded, the whole beginning of this massive brand, as you say, brand synonymous with Irishness, is founded in British ruled Ireland in an era where like it was a highly sectarian state.
The only thing I would say is, like, so the United Irishmen, Republican rebels, criticised Arthur Guinness for being an informer into Dublin Castle to the British authorities. I think people like Arthur Guinness would have just seen themselves as proud Irishmen. Even like into the mid-20th century, you would have had Irish Unionists who were very proud of that connection. And I suppose it's just, and I think Guinnesses in a way are guilty for making Irish identity about being Republican, about being, even though they never ever say it.
Yeah.
But they never deny it. Because it's interesting enough, the Guinness workforce was, you touched on it there, DJ, about sectarianism, and Guinnesses were notorious for not hiring Catholics in prominent in the well-paid positions, and they were considered, like, I suppose, a sectarian employer in that light, and that went on well into the 20th century. And again, I think that's another thing, that a lot of people who drink Guinness, who kind of have the image of Guinness in their head, would be quite shocked to think of a company, like, I think there's almost this idea that they're a company that would have supported rebels and, you know, been on the quote-unquote right side of history.
There's that aspect, but then there's also the aspect of the differentiation between the product and the company, and that those Republicans that were fighting for independence were probably having the pints of Guinness, and that maybe it's that association, it's like the product that's associating with, you know, as in that was the culture that was there at the time, and maybe it's that product that's been associated with it, that rather than the Guinness family themselves, that, you know, and yes,
I think they do, even up to the present, like they put the harp on it, on the pint, and they, you know, the harp is reversed, but consistently throughout their history, they've, through their actions, like the Guinness company have rejected it. Like in 1916, they sacked employees who missed work during the Rising, who had participated in the Rising. That said, you know, we were talking about this before, and I was like, you know, whatever my views are, I don't, you know, if there was an uprising in Ireland today and someone wasn't in work because they were out participating in it, they'd probably get fired. Yeah. Like, it's not you know, I think you look back on history and you're like, how could the Guinness family have done that? And like, you know,
but actually in the day-to-day running of a factory.
But not just the day-to-day running of the factory, who the Guinness family are.
Yeah.
they, you know, I suppose their loyalties and affiliations between 1759 and 1916 probably didn't change.
No, but I like, they moved the headquarters to London. Like, they didn't obviously leave the St James's Gate site, and, you know, there's reasons why you don't, like, that would have presumably been hugely costly. I guess brand-wise, it would have affected them even then.
Also, brewing techniques a century ago, it would have been very difficult to recreate a product in the same line, with the same tastes, to the same quality standards, by building a de novo factory. Like, they can do that now because you have so much control over taste and stuff, whereas the food manufacturing standards at the time wouldn't have facilitated that. So even there are significant logistical challenges. So it could well have been something that they considered, but it probably just wasn't practically feasible, because if they moved to London, the Guinness they were selling in the UK, if they started producing in the UK, it wouldn't have resembled.
You'd hardly want Guinness from the Thames, like.
I'm going to make a really hard segue into another topic. I think that, again, I don't know if this stands really in contrast to the Guinness brand, but I think they have this image like for centuries regarded as the best employers in Dublin, and that is borne out in like this is not just like if we talk earlier about this kind of waving a nod and a wink to kind of a political sympathies, like there's no question they are they have extraordinary conditions, and maybe more so in the past when you compare the conditions for workers in the brewery compared to other employers in Dublin at the time, like workers in James in Guinness's were always treated very well. I don't know, Owen, if you want to talk a bit to that.
Yeah, like I think that they've always nearly developed it as a utopia for workers inside in Dublin, and it was in stark contrast to the living conditions that were in Dublin at the time. They developed neighbourhoods and housing for people who in and around St James's. Arthur Guinness himself was on the board of directors for St James's Hospital. So there's a lot. I suppose it's in very stark contrast to that. Or not really stark contrast, but like it's a juxtaposition to that love of unionism, but there seemed to also have been a love of Dublin at the same time for the Guinness family, and that they put a lot of money into Dublin and into the conditions around the workers there. And I suppose, yes, I did touch on it there, that maybe there was a degree of control about that as well.
You can be really, yeah. There's a real cynicism, you can look at it.
You can look at it, yeah.
Like that they ultimately are benefiting. You know, like at the bottom line, they don't have trouble.
They have low turnover of staff.
Yeah.
They don't. There's people aren't leaving, and the increased productivity on that. And what you're also doing as well is that you're marketing the brand itself. So if you have people who are working there, they're loving it, they're getting a couple of free points as well. They're also telling their mates around and going, Guinness is great.
Part of me wonders, is it like I'm generally pretty skeptical of initiatives like that, like, you know, the Googles of this world, why they're doing it. They're not doing it because they want people to be just generally happy. They want them to be happy at work, and it's very much orientated around work. I don't know where the Guinness family that way, you know, like I think what you talked about earlier is like there's a kind of a patriarchal, or they present themselves as this kind of benign patriarch over their workforce. They want them to be happy, but they're not willing. It's not a two-way street, that if the workers want something that the Guinness family don't want, that's not on the table. And like, because they had all sorts of other things, like, you know, in terms of like Guinness has had a gym.
They had a concert orchestra for entertaining their staff as well, like their own concert orchestra. They've had a pharmacy where all the medications for the members for all your staff members was free of charge, I think, or yeah.
But that being said, right, they're shrewd, excellent business people, and in an era where employers were not renowned for looking after their employees, were they just smarter than everyone else in terms of their employment? And you can look at that from a cynical perspective, as you said, Finn, of like they're just looking after themselves because they ultimately benefit. Like that is a viewpoint. But that's something like we spoke about in a live podcast we did years ago. Like they didn't lock workers out in 1913, you know, so they've looked after their employees.
They did at the same time give money to William Martin Murphy.
Yeah.
Like, so there is that, like their loyalties obviously lay to employers in Dublin, and they were quite happy. I suppose if we're talking about what the motives are, they were quite happy for the likes of William Martin Murphy during the 1913 knockout to drive down conditions of work, but not their workers. And that would make you maybe a little more skeptical about their humanitarian, like if they're happy for people who don't work for them to suffer, but they'll protect their little empire that they benefit off.
But also too, is that not just them be like outsmarting other business people as well? Because now all of a sudden, like as you said, their reputation for a long time has been the best employers in Dublin. That they've manufactured themselves to be the best employers for Dublin by playing that double-edged sword.
And developed themselves as the largest brewery in the world in, I think, around 1890s, 90.
Like the growth of their expansion in the late 19th century, like we talked about it earlier, like where it's kind of like there's someone flicks a switch in terms of, you know, the consumption of pints over spirits, like when there's tax goes on spirits. But Guinnesses are just ready, and there is a ruthless side to that as well, though, the way they run other breweries out. Yeah, and like because they used to have up until I think the 1870s or the 1880s, they used to do, you know, kind of that English style thing where the brewery would have pubs, and they used to sell Guinness at like really low prices to run competition, you know, like to try to so you get that situation in Ireland where local breweries start to disappear because you have essentially Guinnesses and a few others that dominate. Certainly by the early 20th century, I think like the number of breweries in Ireland had really shrunk down.
Well, it didn't. It was the 1990s before it recovered. In terms of the quantity of breweries.
Like there's definitely parts of their history that doesn't sit with the image they project in terms of like the politics that we've already touched on. But I do think it's too simplistic just to go, oh well, they came up with this cunning plan in around 1800 that they treat their workers really well and they would, benefit off that. I don't think it's as cynical as that.
I don't know, with the amount of examples that we've produced here now, I think it's above and beyond what the minimum for keeping those workers happy would be.
I think that's the perfect way to move on to Guinness marketing, because Guinness is, I think, above, if you look at them through the 20th century in particular, their marketing is second to none. Like, I don't know if you could look at any other company in any field that have matched the way Guinnesses have pitched an alcoholic drink, and for a long time had people believing that like it was kind of good for you to have like, and then it was like, you know, like the idea that like pregnant women in Ireland should have Guinness, you know, that the whole thing Guinness is good for you, right through to Arthur's Day. So I don't know if we want to maybe start and maybe talk as well, actually, in case I forget, the Guinness Book of Records, which I think is one of the genius moves of all time. But anyway, yeah, I suppose that idea, like the way they've marketed themselves, I think there is a cynicism to all this in terms of the marketing, like whatever about the other things we've talked about. I think the way Guinnesses have marketed themselves is really cynical. I think Arthur's Day is the pinnacle of all that, but maybe let's go back to like some of the advertising campaigns that have been really effective.
So the small village in Laois, where my wife is from, in the Midlands of Ireland, which is like a part of the country synonymous with cutting turf, so like really hard physical labour, like even up to present day, where like you're hand cutting foot lengths of turf to be burned from bogs, like for hours and hours and hours. And still to this day, in one of the pubs in the village that my wife is from, which when you think about it, it surmises everything we've spoken about. A village in a parish of a couple of hundred people has 3 pubs, has one shop but 3 pubs. And on the main pub, as you drive into the village, the first thing you see is this big, massive gable end of the pub with a huge sign that's been there for decades of a man and a horse. And this man is like chiseled from stone. Like it's like what David would look like if he had a bit of clothes on him, like if we went out putting turf. And he's literally holding a bottle of Guinness in a field. Yeah. And it just says Guinness for strength.
Yeah.
And it's this kind of portrayal of like, you know, you need strength to do this job. This kind of, in order to provide for your family, that sign is from an era of 100 years ago where like manual labour, physical labour was how people provided for their families. And it was this kind of, you need Guinness for strength. If you drink Guinness, you will be able to provide for your family. If you drink Guinness, you will get your work done. And it's just this, and particularly like Ireland had, like particularly in rural Ireland, where, you know, it was like that farm labouring, that hard work, just like all brilliant marketing ads, 3 words and a picture, and it just hit the nail on the head in terms of like, but it's subliminally implies dependence for better performance, as you said, like almost like some sort of health benefit.
Guinness is good for you is another one. Like it's the same kind of...
I said the city version of the rural Guinness for strength.
Yeah. I only realised this recently. The Guinness Book of Records, that was a Guinness ploy essentially, that they came up with this idea. I suppose the equivalent, it's kind of a intellectual equivalent of peanuts or something to keep people drinking. You know, the saltiness keeps people drinking. But the idea was that, I suppose today if we were chatting about some topic and you go, oh, what's the answer? You just Wikipedia it. But back then you'd have these kind of books that you'd have in a pub. That's what it was designed for, where you'd have these facts that, you know, people would have something to talk about. And the first edition of the Guinness Book of Records was released for free. It had a glossy
cover, so basically pints could be spilt onto it, and it survived. It basically was built to last in a pub, and like they went through within a couple of months, they realised that this thing is going to take off on its own, and they then started to sell it. But like what started out as a marketing ploy, like ballooned into this like global phenomenon now of.
That's brilliant though. Imagine like being in a pub, like, oh sure, like Mikko's the tallest man I know. Hold on now. Okay, let me check out the book.
He's not taller than Konstantin Gorbachev.
Like I think in terms of Irish history, in terms of a company, there's just no one that has pulled off that kind of marketing image and that association. But I think as we move towards an end, we cannot finish without talking about Arthur's Day, because that symbolises, I think, some of the most cynical stuff that Guinness have ever done. To explain to people, Arthur's Day was a invention by Guinness in 2009, I think.
Yeah, because it was 150 years, wasn't it?
250? Yeah, 250 years, yeah. So they had this thing called Arthur's Day to mark 250 years since the St. James's Gate Brewery had been founded. And they pitched it almost as this cultural event it was also due to take place on a Thursday night, which happened to be the student night out in Dublin and most cities in Ireland, so they were going to maximise on that. They ploughed loads of money into it, got big artists, big acts, but the key event was at 17:59, relatively early on a drinking evening, they were going to get everyone into a pub, have a pint of Guinness, and the quote was to raise a pint to Arthur. And it became like this weird national holiday initially, but it was like, it was like at a time where people were starting to recognise that, maybe having a culture that's about all drinking all the time is not a great thing. And they tried to manipulate it though, as going, oh well, no, that's not what it's about. It's about a celebration of history and culture. And then they had this musical kind of veneer.
That's the most cynical of it, I think, is like this event to help like small local artists. Yeah. Like, this, like, no, like it's this event to completely monopolise what people are drinking on a day, and to just, like, I can't imagine the profits that they made on Arthur's Day every year. Like, I'd say it's astronomical.
Well, that, and then also like that just day of marketing and advertising, like what's the knock-on effect of that association?
Absolutely. And us as 19-year-old idiots then, like, completely buying into it, like, as in, but when I think back on like how just it just enveloped, like it just took over you for that entire build up to it and everything. I don't know if this was a big thing outside of like our extended circle, but do you remember like drinking Guinness in the build up so that you'd have a stomach for Guinness? I wish I was joking, like, but as a 19-year-old I didn't drink much Guinness, but like you'd literally be like, right, I need to get ready for a day on the stout, like, and you'd be drinking like pints of Guinness
just line the stomach.
Just to line the stomach in the build. But it's exactly what you're saying, Owen. Like, you had this big event coming up where everyone was going to be drinking Guinness all day.
Yeah.
If you compare that to another brand, like, I don't know, like a cigarette company or something like that, that tries to get people to, I don't know, have an extra box of smokes, like, because it was a 200th anniversary of it being founded, or I don't know, even like if Coca-Cola tried to do it, it wouldn't work.
Yeah.
And they managed to internationalize it a bit. Like, it only lasted 3 or 4 years before like they got completely called out, and artists, I think Christy Moore
wrote a song.
Condemning it, and there was a boycott. And then actually in 2012, like the call outs of the ambulances in Dublin were up 30% or something. Like there was a really just damning statistic that I think made Guinness's go, this mightn't be such a good idea, and it was just shelved. But I found that like the height of cynicism. I think it's a cynicism that does go. You could argue it goes through most marketing, because.
Now, thanks for tuning in. I really hope you enjoyed the show. Don't forget to get your tickets to my live podcast coming up in Cork on September the 6th. It's going to be a really great event. I can't wait to see you there. For now, though, I'm going to sign off, but I will be talking to you next week. Until then, Sloan.